Very briefly, without going into too much detail about what I want to make pretty plain, I want to keep it simple. I want to talk about whether the Civil War was about states' rights or whether it was about slavery. I was born in the Northeast. I have lived a long time in the Southeast, and neither view necessarily is held by all people in one particular region. However, the predominant view in the North is the slavery argument is oversimplified, and in the Southeast you hear a lot of people who love to throw the states' rights arguments out there, that those who fought for the Confederacy were fighting for states' rights and whatnot. So very simply, I want to explain what everything I have studied about the Civil War has pointed me to, and it is this. The Civil War was about nullification, and slavery was a huge elephant in the room, so let me explain. The Civil War was about whether states had the right to nullify an act of Congress. Whether or not states could leave the Union, that is not mentioned in the Constitution, and it was actually the New England states, I believe in the 1820s, who first talked about secession. South Carolina also brought up seceding from the Union back when Andrew Jackson, I believe, was president. But they were scared of him, and that didn't happen. Anyway, so do states have the right to nullify an act of Congress? John C. Calhoun, a very famous politician from South Carolina who was living at that time, was a big proponent of nullification. So when people say states' rights, my response is always, states' rights to do what? Because clearly there are rights that they belong to the federal government only, and then there are rights that are reserved for the states, rights that are reserved only for individuals, etc. So when people say states' rights, was it the states' rights to coin money? Was it the states' rights to declare war? It was the states' rights to own slaves. This was the issue of the time. There had been decades of compromises, and the elephant in the room, again, was always slavery. Do we get rid of it? As a matter of fact, there were many different voices before the Civil War. Many people in the North wanted to allow the South to keep their slaves. Many people in the South wanted to stay in the Union. There were debates before Fort Sumter was attacked in South Carolina, which is what began the Civil War. There were talks all throughout the South as to whether they should secede, whether they should continue negotiating with other states for a peaceful separation. And what Lincoln did, I believe deliberately, was against the wishes of South Carolina, he supplied Fort Sumter with privations. Supposedly there were no arms involved, but that is up for historical debate. And I believe he knew that South Carolina would perhaps take that as some form of aggression, and they attacked Union troops. What this did was this unified Northern opinion, because Union troops had been attacked by a Southern state, and it divided Southern opinion. There were other states that were not as yet willing to secede from the Union as South Carolina was. So the South was not willing to drastically change its economy by getting rid of slaves. This was something that it was becoming apparent that this was going to happen. Free soilers, people who wanted the complete abolition of slavery, we'll say abolitionists, they were not the majority. In 1860, they were not the majority. In 1863, they were not the majority. The vast majority of people, from what I understand, in both the North and the South, were pro-Union. As a matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln, who many of the states' rights people love to point to this, Abraham Lincoln was for preserving the Union. There's speeches where he talks about what he really wants is to preserve the Union. His intention isn't necessarily to get rid of slavery. Okay. I've come to the conclusion by about 1863 it became apparent that the only way to preserve the Union was to get rid of slavery. So, with many issues, over time certain things become apparent. So certain politicians do change their stances on things. Thomas Jefferson was a good example. Depending on what area of a figure's life you choose to look at, they may have had a different position. So people often like to say that one person contradicts another person. Some people like to know which way the wind is blowing. I understand that. There are a lot of flip-floppers and they want to do what's popular. But oftentimes, people's position changes on something as they get new information, as new situations arise, and what have you. Slavery, yes. Slavery was a key issue. But nullification more specifically explains what this was all about. And people who subscribe to John C. Calhoun's interpretation of the Constitution or his stance believed that states had a right to nullify an act of Congress when they deemed it unconstitutional. What I have to say to that is that makes the federal court system completely obsolete. Why is there a federal court system if states can just void an act of Congress? Or for that matter, why is there even a Congress to make decisions, supranational decisions or supra-state decisions, if states could just nullify an act of Congress? That was part of the problem, part of the weakness under the Articles of Confederation. That's why we created a more national, centralized constitution with checks and balances to prevent too much centralization. So it was about nullification. To be very simple, very simply, nullification doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It makes the court system obsolete. It makes Congress itself obsolete. And slavery was a big part of it. It became very obvious that you had to get rid of slavery in this country. There were decades of compromises. It ultimately led to the Civil War. When people say states' rights, they're referring to states' rights to nullify an act of Congress. And the reason they were concerned with maintaining these rights was because they wanted to ensure that slavery continued to exist in their states. I got a little bit off track. I wanted to mention all the different types of factions that existed. I mentioned people in the North and the South and how they had different opinions as to preserving the Union. There were radicals who were abolitionists in the North, but they were not the majority. There were people who just completely wanted to get rid of it. There were people who wanted free states to be admitted along with slave states, etc., etc. People who were not willing to compromise. And at this time, if it wasn't for the Civil War, there's a very good chance that the United States, or at least the southern states, would have continued to expand down into Latin America. A lot of people who are not that interested in history don't know that. But the southern states wanted to expand the institution of slavery, and the Civil War prevented that from happening. So I just wanted to make those points. I don't like it when I hear it's about states' rights because it just really doesn't do justice. It really doesn't do justice to the topic. And yes, perhaps there are self-righteous, perhaps somewhat ignorant people in the North who say, oh, well, the North wanted to get rid of slaveries and all that. It wasn't that simple. It was the most trying time in our history. We're very fortunate that we made it through. And that's all I have to say on that topic. Please like and subscribe if you are interested, and I will see you in the next video.